It has been said that he who dies with the most toys. You know, the reality of the statement is actually this. He who dies with the most toys, well, he dies. He's still dead. That's right. He's still dead. We come to the last sermon of our series on James, and it's probably the most stinging of all of them. And if we want to keep with our analogy of the letter of James being like the waves of the ocean, we might entitle this wave, "Beware of the misery only money can buy." Beware the misery that only money can buy. In chapter 5, verse 1, James says this, "Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you." Those are odd words, and they sound oddly familiar to words from the first sermon we looked in this series, which is when James said that a rich person should take pride in their low position. And just as it seemed odd for a rich person to take pride in their low position, it seems kind of strange for a rich person to weep and wail over their coming misery. Why would James say that? I mean, the rich, we've talked about this. They have everything. If they want it, they can buy it. They're the ones that people want to be around. They're the ones that get the invitations to the fancy dinners. The foundations, the charities, they have their name, and they love to call upon them. Misery? Why misery? I mean, come on now. If you want that dream home, you can buy it. You want that fancy car? Here's the keys. The world is your oyster. You can have it all. So why in the world would James be saying for the rich people to weep and wail over their coming misery? Well, the answer is this. Stored up wealth, wealth that has been stored up in the scheme of eternity, is useless. James's brother, you may know him as Jesus, he once told a parable, and it went like this. He said, "There once was a rich man who had a field that produced one year this abundant crop. And so abundant was the crop that he did not have enough room to store all the surplus. So he did something that was very wise. He asked himself, what am I going to do with all of this surplus? And then he did another wise thing. He says, I know what I'll do is I'll knock down my barns, I'll build up bigger ones, and I'll store all of my excess grain in those barns." All seemingly wise things to do. He didn't leave it there to rot. He wanted to do something with it. But then something insidiously creeps into his mind, and this is where the story takes a turn. He says to himself, "You have much stored up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But what the man did not know is that God would come to him on that very night, and he would say to him, "You fool, you fool. This very night, your life is demanded from you. Now, what will happen to all of the wealth that you stored up?" And the answer is nothing. It'll go to no one. Nothing. It has been stored up, but it was never used for the good of those around him that may have needed it. He never gave his workers an extra boost of money because of all the surplus that came in. He just kept it for himself. And similarly, in verse 2 of chapter 5, James says, your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Stored up wealth in the scheme of eternity is useless wealth. It doesn't do anything. Now, I want to be careful that you know what James is saying and what he's not saying. James is not saying that you should not save your money. The book of Proverbs says, the wise person stores up choice foods and olive oil, but the fool gulps them down. And even Joseph, he was very wise when he stored up all the grain in Egypt, so when the famine came, he had grain for the Egyptians to eat, and for those around him, the surrounding territories, to come and buy grain in Egypt. There is a difference between hoarding wealth and saving wealth. To save wealth means that you're storing money aside for something specific in the future. To hoard wealth means you're just hoarding it to keep it for yourself. Now, I had thought about how can we really apply this to our lives, and I thought, well, maybe we can have like a mini financial seminar right now, and I could tell you what are good things to save for, what are not good things to save for, what it might be a good loan, what might not be a bad loan. But then all of a sudden it occurred to me that you can't really have any type of formula to apply exactly what James is saying here. So I'll try my best from personal experience to explain it. The most important check that I write is the check that is my offering to God. It's the most important check that I write. Because with that check, I say, Lord, I trust you to provide everything I need. With this check, I admit that every good thing that I have received has actually come from you. And with this portion of that which you have given to me, I am dedicating all of it to the use of your kingdom. Now, just in case you think that I'm throwing in a stewardship sermon in the middle of James, I'm really not doing that. In fact, it turns out that about half of Jesus' parables had to do with wealth, so there really should be more accidental stewardship sermons out there. There really should. It shouldn't just be during stewardship time. But I will say this. The Apostle Paul, quoting Jesus, said in the book of Acts, "It is better to give than to receive." And you know what? There's a lot of purchases in my life that I regret. I mean, there are just some gizmos that I have purchased that collect dust in the corner. No idea why in the world they were purchased. I have books that I purchased because I really like books. And I said, surely I'm going to read this. But never ever thought to myself, am I really going to read this? And I keep telling myself, someday I will read that book. I've had it for 10 years, but I'm going to read it. I probably will never read that book. There are purchases that I regret. But I have never ever regretted anything that I've given to the mission of any congregation that I've been a part of. I've never regretted any money that I've given to a ministry. I've never regretted it. There is something about making the kingdom of God our highest priority. And when we always look at our wealth, at our material possessions in light of the kingdom of God, and if we seek to appropriate that which has been given to us to the glory of that kingdom, I don't think we can go wrong. I've yet to figure out the magic formula. and you're going to have to figure it out on your own. But I think that what James is saying is that don't make it all about money and how much you can accumulate. Make it about the kingdom of God. I don't even think that James is saying that you should never have a nice meal or you should never go out to a show. But always do it with an acknowledgement of God's kingdom and what gives God the greatest glory. Beware of the misery only money can buy, because money that is hoarded up in the last days is useless money. It does you nor anyone else any good. The other thing that James talks about or warns about is the injustice that money can buy. He warns about the injustice that money can buy. You know, people frequently, well, I should start with this. God may be long-suffering, or he may be patient, but he's not deaf. Let me tell you what I mean by that. People will oftentimes come to me and they'll say, you know what, if God is all-loving and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there? And I oftentimes want to ask, well, who do you think or what do you think is causing the suffering? And if the person was really honest for a moment, they would say, well, we caused the suffering. And then I would ask, well, what if God was to take care of that suffering instantly, just like that? What would happen? And if they were honest enough, the person would say, none of us would be here. God is patient. The old word for it is long-suffering. That means that he suffers with the pain of the world until his plan can be completed and as many people can enter his kingdom as possible. He's long-suffering. But we must never, ever mistake God's long-suffering for his deafness. The Bible tells us that the blood of Abel cried out from the ground, and God heard it. The Bible tells us that the Israelites cried out to God in their pain and their suffering and their slavery, and God heard it. And James says that those who have been exploited, whose wages have been withheld, the Lord of hosts hears them too. Never mistake God's long suffering for his deafness, because he hears. Gary Haugen of the International Justice Mission tells the story of Mariama. And Mariama is kind of a depiction of some of the injustice that exists in our world against the poor, the vulnerable, the helpless. Mariama was working in a brick factory about 60 kilometers from Bangalore, India. And at that place, she would work from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, 6 days a week, carrying 60, 70 pounds of bricks on her head for 30, 50, 100-yard spans, and just would do that monotonously throughout the day. But you know what? In this particular brick factory, as bad as things may have seemed for her, she always got fed. She always got one day off, and she was able to go wherever she wanted when she was not working. And her basic needs were taken care of. Not saying it was a good situation, but I'm just saying what you're about to hear was better than what happened. One day, a person came along, and Mariama and the group of people who worked with her were there, and this man offered them. He said, I will give you guys what's the equivalent of $333 to come to my factory. And that amounted to about $40 a person. And they got to that new factory, and immediately this new owner and his son said, well, you guys owe me that money that I gave you to move here. And they made their wages such that they could never, ever repay that debt. And like that, they became slaves. And the owner and the owner's son would bring a band of thugs in, and from periodically, this band of thugs would take one of the workers, throw them into a room, and beat the living daylights out of them and do other things that are unmentionable to some of them. And they would bring out the person and said, well, if you try to run away, this is what will happen to you. And they would hold up this person who's been all beaten up. Well, to make a long story short, the International Justice Mission got hold of what was going on, and it was actually a pretty common practice throughout India, but they had picked this one because they thought they could do something. And they videotaped the women's testimony. The police came. They actually caught the owner red-handed with a group of people locked up in a room. And they went to the judge, and they said, you know what, you need to prosecute them. And according to the laws in India, you're not allowed to enslave people. But the judge came back and said, well, there's about 11 reasons, basically loopholes, some of them weren't even true, of why the judge would not hear that case. It was a corrupt criminal justice system, utterly corrupt, totally favoring those who had the wealth, the money, the power. And the International Justice Mission, anyone else would have given up, but they kept going, they kept going, they kept going. Finally, they managed to get the owner and his son arrested. And he was imprisoned. But as soon as he was imprisoned, he was released on bail for, I quote, they were not doing well. And the owner and the son were allowed to escape, and they were able to destroy all the evidence before the government could get there and they could collect it. The story did end up working out well, and Mariam and the workers were released. But it's a story that represents the injustice that is in our world. And yes, we have much to be thankful in being Americans in that we have one of the greatest criminal justice systems in the world. However, even in our own country, injustice happens. Multinational corporations, they can decide to move to another country, pay people less than they should be getting paid for that job, give them horrible working conditions, and we in America, the consumers, benefit from their hardship and their heartache. Governments, whether it's our own government, whether it's Democrat policies, whether it's Republican economic policies, whatever the policies, so often that term national interest, it's just kind of thrown around as a way to say, well, some rich people are going to benefit from this, but you know what, the average consumer, they're really going to be hung out to dry. It's not going to help them at all. So we use this phrase, national interest, as if we're actually doing something. Or what about when employees in our very own country who work 40 hours a week, who show up on time, do everything that they're supposed to do, but somehow they still end up on food stamps or on government welfare programs? Should anyone in our country really work 40 hours a week, show up on time, be good workers, and still have to rely on such programs? There's much injustice, and we might say, well, what are we to do about that? And really, in global perspective, every single one of us is fairly wealthy. What are we supposed to do with that? Well, I think what we can do is seek to be just in our financial endeavors. If we're an employer, we should seek to pay our employees an adequate wage for the work that they do. If we're a consumer, it may behoove us to do a little bit of research into the things that we buy and find out what really goes on behind the scenes for the things that we purchase. Money can buy injustice. But as those who are called to be the light of the world, the salt of the world, we need to do better. We need to shine more brightly. Money can buy injustice. What else can money buy? Well, according to James, money can also buy self-indulgence. In verse 5, James says of chapter 5, "You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the last day in the day of slaughter." You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You know, when I was in biblical university, when I was getting my undergrad, one of my best friends was an exchange student from West Africa. And he didn't have a car, so I got to drive him around from time to time to get things. And I remember taking him to his first department store. I think it was a Walmart, I'm not really sure. And he was just enthralled. I mean, he thought he's putting on hats. How does this hat look on me? He's going over to Discman. Yes, it was when Discmen were popular. He's going over to the Discman and going, oh, I really need one of these. And he would go from one thing to the next. And finally I said, Matipa, I think you're falling victim to American marketing. And it became a running joke wherever we went. And he would say, I want this or I want that. Mike, am I falling victim to American marketing? We do live in a consume culture. That's the law of the land, to consume, to have more, to live luxuriously, to have all the things that you want, because let's face it, you really cannot be happy unless you're drinking that brand of soda. You really can't make it in life until you're driving that sleek and sexy car. You really have not made it unless you're eating that snack food, which when everyone eats it, they're just as happy as they are in the commercial. I mean, really. That's kind of where we are at. That's the kind of culture we live in. Consume, buy more, buy more, buy more. When will enough ever be enough? Well, what is the danger of overconsumption? Well, what does James say? He says you have, let me make sure I get it right here. Verse 5, the second half of it. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. In the Greek, it literally reads, you have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. And it's a double entendre in the Greek, because occasionally the word heart in Greek can mean your midsection. So it can literally mean that you have, fattened yourself, your midsection. However, the heart can also be used of desires. You have fed your desires. And what happens when you just keep feeding and feeding your desires? Well, you kind of become like the goat that has been fattened in the field that just has enough grass for the goat to eat forever and ever, so that on the feast day, the goat might be slaughtered. So the goat feels pretty good being in that pen. I mean, it's doing really well. It's eating up all the grass. It has everything it can need. It can sleep when it wants because there's always enough food for it. But in the end, what happens to that goat? It ends up being slaughtered. James says, and this is the most stinging passage in all of James. He says, it's like you are the goat being fattened for the day of slaughter. There are purchases we don't need to make. Everything is perfect for us to impulsively buy. We have one-click shopping, 24/7 access to anything in the world we could possibly want. We can buy anything at any time. You don't need to buy everything. Every purchase that seems like a good idea today may not be a good idea tomorrow. We don't need to consume. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't enjoy the good things that God has given us. It just means don't overindulge in them. Beware of the misery only money can buy. For those of you who have observed, you may have noticed that I didn't reference this last verse yet. And it says this in our NIV, you have condemned and murdered innocent men who are not opposing you. In the Greek, it actually, if you were to translate it more literally, it would say, you condemned, you murdered the righteous one. He was not opposing you. And yes, it is about the righteous people who are being oppressed by those who have power and who are able to oppress them. But I think James's readers would not miss the connection. Who's the righteous one? It's Jesus Christ. They would have recognized that it's Jesus Christ. He was the righteous one. He had all the wealth, all the glory, glory unimaginable in heaven, more than we could ever dream of. And he became poor for our sake, becoming human like us, taking on our flesh, dwelling among us. He became poor for our sake, and when they came after them, he did not resist them. He said, Peter, put down your sword. He did not resist them. As we end this series in the book of James, we might be tempted to say, okay, I get it. I have my checklist on the things in my life that I need to work at. I just need to get better at favoritism. I need to get better at expressing the faith that I confess. I need to be better at looking after orphans and widows. I need to make sure that I view myself properly, not according to how the world views me, and I could check off all these things. Well, that would be good. It would be good to put some effort into it. There's nothing wrong with that. But you know what? You probably will fail unless you take one more step. You need to look at the one who has done all of these things. You need to look to Christ. That's how we get there. And when we start going in the other direction, we go, oh, wait. That's why prayer is so important. It realigns our focus on the Christ. And when I find myself showing favoritism, I'm like, oh, wait, Lord, you didn't show favoritism. Or when I say, oh, yeah, I believe this, but I'm not really acting the way that I believe, you're like, well, you had integrity, Jesus. Maybe I should do that. We keep looking to that example of the righteous one. Let us look to the face of Christ to be everything that we are called to be, that our faith may be consistent with our actions. Let us rise and